Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bargaining with Beijing, the politics of Chinese investment in America. This event is part of the ACF Ideas series, which is hosted by the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs, or ACF as we call it, here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm Margaret Myers, the Managing Director of ACF, and thank you all so much for being here. This promises to be a very engaging and indeed very timely panel, and we are extremely fortunate to have not only an esteemed group of panelists, but also Shawn Donnan from Bloomberg, who has agreed to be our guide through this discussion and has monitored possible U.S.-China deal making very carefully in recent days and hours, I would say. So, Shawn, so grateful for your moderation of this panel and turning the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks to you folks out there in the audience for joining us this Monday morning here for this virtual session. And thank you, of course, to the folks at Johns Hopkins SAIS, the Institute for America, China, and Future Global Affairs for bringing us together. We're here to discuss the politics of Chinese investment in America and how they might be evolving. And before we go any further, just wanted to throw out a bit of small housekeeping note. Please shoot us any questions you may have using the Q&A function that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, and we'll do our best to get to them over the next hour as we continue this discussion. I think we should probably start with some context. There are some big Chinese companies invested in the US already. There is, of course, TikTok. Some of you may have seen the film American Factory about the Fuyao glass purchase of a former GM plant in Dayton, Ohio, and how they turned it into one of the world's largest auto glass factories. CATL is building a big battery plant with Ford in Michigan. BYD, the Chinese EV maker. People often talk about, will they come and build an auto plant here someday and crack the U.S. market? Well, they're here already and have been for some time. They have a big bus factory in California. And there are already Chinese companies making all sorts of things here in the U.S., often under the radar. The Chinese companies are a relatively small but meaningful part of the U.S. economy. When you look at FDI numbers, the value of Chinese foreign direct investment in the U.S. is about $34 billion. That was at the end of 2024, and that's the total stock that's been built up over years. Just for context, that's a third the value of Australia's, which obviously is a much smaller economy than China's. And it's less than 5%, the $750 billion plus that Japanese firms have invested in the US over decades. It's a very different story, obviously, from China's treasury holdings, and that's not really what we're here talking about today. At the end of July, the Chinese government and other bodies held more than $730 billion in U.S. treasuries. So I throw that out there as context, but again, that's not really what we're going to be talking about here today. For many years, that small FDI position has been the result of twin government policies, right? We know that China's capital controls and restraints on outbound investment have limited Chinese investment in the US, although some of that is loosened over recent years. And globally, China is becoming a much more significant outbound investor. And at the same time, we know that there is here in Washington and around the country, in some states as well, a wariness about Chinese investment. And there's been growing scrutiny of it over the past 10, 15 years, particularly by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, which is an acronym that Chinese companies coming here don't really like to hear. But we're at this moment where we may actually be seeing some change happening on both sides. As I mentioned earlier, China is becoming a increasingly significant outbound investor around the world. And President Trump, meanwhile, has been, while he's been throwing up tariffs, he's also drawing big investment pledges from other countries, a big part of his trade negotiations. There's a $1.4 trillion 10-year pledge from the UAE, a $550 billion promise from Japan. There's a $350 billion promise from South Korea that he's going to be talking about there this week. And we at Bloomberg earlier this month reported that China has proposed a big surge in investment as part of these trade negotiations, with some of the numbers that we were hearing topping $1 trillion potentially as an offer. In return, the Chinese would want some loosening of those aforementioned limits on investment, like CFIUS. They don't want to commit to projects only to be rejected by CFIUS, which is fair. That's enough for me. We should probably move over to much more eminent panelists. I'm going to give you a quick intro to them. Kate Logan is the director for the China Climate Hub and Climate Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, where she leads work on China's domestic climate policy and international engagement. Kate, welcome. Jeremy Wallace is one of SAIS's own. He is the A. Doak Barnett Professor of China Studies at SAIS. He studies Chinese politics, climate change, cities, and statistics, and is the author of Seeking Truth and Hiding Facts, Information, Ideology, and Authoritarianism in China, 2022 book from the Oxford University Press. And Ted Fertik is the Vice President for Manufacturing and Industrial Policy at the BlueGreen Alliance, where he leads strategy, team management, policy development, and advocacy on clean technology, manufacturing, and industrial transformation. So that's enough with the intros and the context. Let's get over to the questions. Let's start with you, Jeremy. I think I'm going to ask you to kind of run through what we are actually seeing currently in terms of Chinese investment in the U.S., particularly in energy and manufacturing.
That's great. So thanks so much for moderating this discussion and for everyone joining in. So the Chinese investment, as Shawn put it, is relatively small player, especially compared to its economy and especially compared to its trade numbers, right? So most economic interaction with China in physical goods is kind of like shipped back and forth, not made by Chinese firms or kind of owned by Chinese firms in the United States. The investment numbers are relatively small. We're still in the order of just a few $billion, whereas kind of outbound investment from China is already on the order of $10 billion a month. So most of that going not to the United States, obviously, or else we'd see very different totals. And so the kind of like the idea that China is an insular economy that is only kind of making things in China and sending them abroad is a bit understated, that they are increasingly investing abroad, building facilities in various parts of the world. In the United States, we're still relatively early days, and as the limits that Shawn suggested put out there, the different types of policies and regulations that Chinese firms face kind of exist at national and local levels. So the national level CFIUS makes it difficult for Chinese firms to acquire American assets, particularly firms or others that have industrial policy or maybe some connection to kind of national security in some form. On the other hand, kind of greenfield investments, if it's just a Chinese firm kind of setting up shop and building something on its own, is seen as has been seen traditionally as a way to kind of avoid some of those regulations, right? There's not a fear of intellectual property if you're just buying some land in Iowa. On the other hand, there are still lots of concerns at the local level that have been put forward, regulations that states have made restricting Chinese investment, even to the point of restricting Chinese individuals from buying housing or something along those lines. So the space for Chinese investment in the United States is a complicated one, but as Shawn suggested, I do think it's shifting.
Do you want to talk us through just a little bit more about how it's shifting?
So I think there's a strong sense in which Trump is particularly interested in investment in America, making things in America. And I think not that the Biden administration was not interested in as such, but I think that there's a little bit more willingness to to allow or to encourage Chinese investment in these new sectors along the green tech sectors of solar, EVs, and batteries, where Chinese firms are relatively in the lead. And I think that shift in narrative is pretty interesting and important for the political space. That I think a lot of the resistance to Chinese investment in the United States comes from this political notion that the United States is ahead. Chinese investments are trying to really just steal American IP and send it back to China in order to steal American jobs. And I think the shift in narrative, and if not shift in kind of real resource, is a demonstration of the fact that Chinese firms are often ahead in technologically. And so in order to move to the technology frontier, it would be nice to have some of that advanced technology in the United States. And that probably means Chinese investment here. And I think that that shift in narrative is really a difficult one. So rather than it be a national security issue for the United States, where we're worried about our intellectual property being stolen by Chinese firms, the story is much more about Chinese firms bringing technology to the United States to hopefully allow it to diffuse and kind of like help build up supply chains in these advanced sectors.
I mean, that is a really a flipping of the narrative that we've had in recent decades, isn't it? Kate, a big part of the story in recent years has been in clean tech. Can you talk us through the existing Chinese joint ventures in the US in that realm and what we've learned from them so far?
Yeah, good question. I think, so from a climate perspective, obviously, the current administration is going in a quite negative direction. So I think, it's an interesting situation where you have potentially more openness from a US-China perspective, but at the same time, the sectors that China is most interested in investing in globally because of China's dominance in clean tech, and that's primarily batteries, electric vehicles, and solar, which are referred to as the new three, are also sectors that are sort of under attack by the current administration in the US. So it's quite interesting from that perspective. And one of the ways that we've framed it is that you see a situation where the policies are getting ahead of the politics. So under the previous administration, you had the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which aimed to incentivize onshoring of clean tech manufacturing and, to be wary of foreign investment such that US companies could benefit from it, but still be open at the same time to a certain level of investment. So what that did is it did bring in a certain number of Chinese joint ventures. Obviously, there's also the well-known licensing agreement between Ford and CATL. We mapped around 14 or 15 of these joint ventures, which are interestingly primarily across red states. This is across the solar and battery sectors. Obviously, electric vehicles quite different, and that the administration took a very security-minded approach and used things like the connected vehicles rule to sort of block any electric vehicle investments outright. But obviously, the batteries investments are propping up that sector and hopefully going toward US companies that are leveraging those batteries for manufacturing. But under the current administration, after the reconciliation bill was adopted in July, you see increased restrictions that Chinese companies, which on one hand, I think a key point to emphasize is that because of the domestic competition in China being so fierce amongst these sectors and these companies needing external revenue from international markets, especially high-end markets like the US and the EU, on the other hand, the regulatory environment in the US is becoming increasingly complex. So the reconciliation bill introduced new restrictions around something that first came up under Biden administration, which is this idea of foreign entity of concern rules in order to access tax credits. What's interesting is that it's sector by sector. So for sectors like solar and wind, those tax credits disappear so soon that there's an open question as to whether they even, really matter in terms of companies trying to comply with them. But for batteries, which I would sort of argue as one of the key sectors where the US could really benefit from Chinese investment if done the right way, those tax credits last out until 2034. So, the way that these foreign entity of concern rules are implemented is really important. They apply at both the firm level, the facility level. We're also still waiting on the Treasury guidance. So I think we're in a really interesting time where you have this conflation of, policies going in one direction, especially for those sectors and clean tech, politics moving in another direction, and perhaps a still open, but probably decreasing window of opportunity to try and figure out how can we leverage this interest from Chinese companies for our own advantage rather than, being so scared of the risks that we block out the things that we could be gaining from Chinese investment.
There's a lot there and a lot that I want to come back to, but I want to get Ted into this conversation before we do that. Ted, one of the striking things I remember about the American Factory film, uh, which was the first documentary I think put out by the Obama production company, and was a really striking kind of fly on the wall look at this Chinese company landing in Dayton, Ohio, and what in the end ends up being a real clash of cultures. You could see these earnest young Chinese workers who had come over to the U.S. and were baffled by their U.S. colleagues who didn't want to work weekends and vice versa. So I wonder if you can just talk us through what the concerns are of U.S. stakeholders, from policymakers to unions, when they look at Chinese investment right now. And are there any opportunities for alignment? Or are we looking at, as Kate kind of pointed to there, kind of more and more limits on Chinese investment?
Good question. Thank you, Shawn. It's good to be here. I think that we have to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush, and different stakeholders have different sets of concerns about different types of investments. But where I would start is to say that although it in some ways is conventional to separate the question of Chinese FDI in the US from the question of US trade with China and China's role as an actor in world trade, I think for many stakeholders, you can't make that separation, or not cleanly anyway. And that a lot of their concerns about Chinese FDI trace back to their concerns about the way that China conducts itself in the system of global trade. And I don't need to rehearse, I'm sure, for this audience, all the concerns that many stakeholders have in the US and around the world around Chinese trade, or the trading practices of Chinese companies and the Chinese government, and the relationship between China's industrial policy, subsidies, various forms of state ownership, state involvement in the economy, and what that means for the global trading regime. I don't need to rehearse all of that. But, Shawn, you brought up one example of a Chinese investment, actually two, both of which I think could be illustrative in different ways of some of the possible concerns and perhaps some of the possible openings. So you mentioned the BYD electric bus facility in California, which has been there since the 2010s, and has been the source of some controversy, but not with any clean division between stakeholders. So that is, in fact, a unionized facility, and the union that represents the workers there has generally been supportive of that facility and its ability to produce electric buses for the U.S. market. But other unions and other union-aligned and other stakeholders have taken real issue with that facility. And I think it's useful to highlight the specific concerns. So that's a facility that is producing electric buses. Initially was producing them in conjunction with various forms of federally financed procurement. So U.S. Federal taxpayer money was available to jurisdictions that were purchasing buses from that facility, as they were to any other electric bus facility in the country. But there was a major concern that even though that facility might be meeting statutory Buy America requirements in terms of the extent of the content that was domestically sourced, nevertheless, it was, as certain stakeholders understood it, primarily importing finished or nearly finished components and subcomponents and merely assembling them in the U.S. And that pattern of manufacturing in the U.S. was not actually, to Jeremy's earlier point, something that would lead to the building up of U.S. supply chains, but actually the opposite. It's a practice that over time would lead to the weakening and perhaps even elimination of U.S. supply chains if Chinese manufacturers who were operating in the U.S. were sourcing significant amounts of their inputs from China. And you can find that kind of concern in a lot of different contexts. But I would say that the question goes perhaps even deeper than that, and it goes to the interpretation that actors have and that stakeholders have of what the intentions of Chinese companies and the Chinese state are with respect to FDI. So if we imagine that it's a purely commercial undertaking, one set of concerns may apply. But if the assessment of the intention of Chinese companies and the Chinese state goes deeper than that, in the sense that perhaps, as some critics have alleged, the Chinese state is interested in eliminating competition from other countries in various sectors, that it deliberately depresses prices in certain sectors in order to make competition from other parts of the world impossible. If you believe that actors are, that the Chinese state and Chinese companies are so inclined, then you might conclude that allowing Chinese companies to set up shop in the United States poses a deeper kind of risk about empowering those companies in a competitive global landscape that ultimately won't work out to the benefit of U.S. companies or the U.S. economy as a whole. But I don't think stakeholders are of one mind about how we should interpret that. Nor is it the same in every circumstance. But I would just highlight that those kinds of the perception of those kinds of deep risks, I think, pervades any discussion of this topic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, one of the things I've been hearing a lot recently from American companies who are competing with Chinese companies who have landed here is that Chinese companies seem to have found a way to minimize the impact of tariffs, for example, by some transfer pricing between subsidiaries. We had some questions there on whether or not there's going to be a recording of this. Yes, there is going to be a recording of this. It will be available. You will all be YouTube stars in the future. I can guarantee that. And also just a reminder, if you have questions, please use them in the Q&A feature. Carol Wise is in there now telling us that this is an excellent panel, and we welcome that. We'd also welcome some questions, though. Jeremy, let's build a little bit on what Ted said there. This is not just about attracting investment to the United States. This is also a conversation about industrial competitiveness, right? I mean, there is a big competition between these two very large economies on everything from AI to kind of old-fashioned industry to new clean tech as we've been talking about in EVs. I wonder how you think about Chinese investment in that context. I mean, as Ted points out, shouldn't there be some wariness about letting these big Chinese players in and potentially undermining U.S. supply chains at a time when we're all thinking about supply chain resilience and reshoring and big ideas like that?
I do think that it is a complicated question. I think as someone increasingly thinking about climate change, I think the expansion of clean technologies in the United States feels like a relatively important good, and so I tend to lean in that direction, but I am very aware of the possibility, both the national security concerns that I think could be real or could be quite serious, and then the way that Ted described that different actors have different interpretations about the willingness to actually extend supply chains and to build out in a commercial fashion a real supply chain in the United States. I think the idea of resilience and trying to move beyond just thinking about kind of like a very brittle supply chain where the least cost manufacturer is the one kind of like link in the chain, and then any breaking of that chain is a problem for manufacturing facilities, is something that you can think of, well, maybe Chinese investment is helpful in that process because it like kind of creates a multiplicity of suppliers, multiplicity of linkages. I think that is possibly a kind of a positive view as opposed to the kind of like on the ground view. But I think there are different ways in which we can think about investments, and there are different rules and regulations about the ways in which we can manage Chinese investments in the United States. I think overall, the Chinese kind of industrial sector built out itself to huge scale, in part for the reasons that that some, I'm sure, probably thought that they could like push out the rest of the world's production capacity by pushing down prices. But I think for the most part, they were building for a domestic market in a very competitive fashion, meeting huge demand needs domestically. And as the Chinese economy has slowed, especially in kind of construction and other heavy industry sectors over the past few years, those companies have built out these facilities and would really like to use them in productive fashion. And so that's an export story if we're talking about things made in China and sent to the rest of the world. But those firms are also interested in kind of like doing what they can, not just to ship Chinese-made goods abroad, but to diversify their own portfolios in order to build practices, build facilities in the rest of the world in order to like acknowledging the concerns about everything being made in China. And I think a political concern in the United States is not just are these firms not actually interested in really building, but only assembling, but also is the United States interested or allowing Chinese firms to take some of the profits of these key sectors of the future? Or is that itself a red line that, well, what we need is kind of American companies to do well, and American companies need to get as much profits as they can from the American market? And I worry that that line of thought ends up with a very protectionist, kind of like walled off world where the United States is kind of left behind as the rest of the world moves forward in a more kind of advanced, but also just cheaper and cleaner kind of line of industrial production and consumption.
Kate, I want to come to you because you mentioned in the context of clean tech that Chinese companies were looking for overseas markets, advanced overseas markets, and you mentioned Europe as well there. And I wonder if we can just quickly walk us through a little bit how the EU is dealing with this, and whether it's just how different that is from the US. I had a fascinating conversation a couple of months ago with a Spanish minister who, at the time, I think this was actually last year, who made the point that as the EU was at that time considering putting tariffs on Chinese EVs, he also had a Chinese EV company which had taken over a auto plant that had already gone out of business by a big Western company and was actually creating jobs there in Spain. And recently we've had some stories on European officials thinking about requiring things like the exchange of intellectual property as part of joint ventures there in Europe. That seems to be that there's still a lot of suspicion of Chinese investment in Europe that we see, but they seem to be engaging in a different way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I'm sure you also have lots to say on this topic as well. I think with the EU, what's interesting is that the EU invited Chinese FDI before it's securitized in a similar way to the US. So, the EU did not close off investment from Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers like BYD and others. And also, from a solar perspective, which was much more open than the US, but now has shifted tack and sort of followed the US lead in trying to figure out how to manage what they perceive as some of the risks of Chinese investment, both to industry and from a security perspective. And what we see now is greenfield investment has slowed dramatically in Europe, almost to a pause. And recent reporting as well, saying that the EU is considering regulations that they'll announced next month in terms of requiring some degree of forced tech transfer, not just for Chinese companies, but for companies, all foreign companies investing in the EU. But I think part of the question here is, what is the balance in terms of making demands of companies that enable them to actually invest in the local market versus those demands being so restrictive that the regulations basically block out anything constructive from moving forward that might actually benefit the local economy? So I think, part of this in the EU situation is, for instance, if the costs are much greater in terms of access to local land, local content requirements for companies to actually be able to meet them. So maybe you have Chinese companies that are interested in investing, but the regulations are so complex and slow and bureaucratic that in practice it's difficult to meet them. I think that's sort of a direction that we see the EU going. So it really depends on, how this new tech transfer policy plays out in practice. I think the theory of it is good, and it's something that the U.S. should certainly study and follow the lead on. But I think it could be a really interesting situation given what I mentioned earlier on the opening of the political dynamics in the U.S. or potential opening, where the EU, I think, would be much slower to shift. So if, for instance, the U.S. does open up to more Chinese investment with some sort of deal that we've been discussing in a hypothetical context, but the EU is moving in another direction, what happens in that situation? So we're in a really interesting time.
Ted, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I mean, I think in the U.S. context, a lot depends on how we imagine that the investment is coming in and under what conditions it's trying to enter the U.S. market. So, a lot of the controversy in the U.S. context has been around access to tax credits, right? And there has obviously been a lot of discussion and some concern about whether so-called foreign entities of concern can, under any circumstances, access U.S. tax credits. And the original, as Kate mentioned earlier, the original Inflation Reduction Act had one set of foreign entities of concern restrictions, but they were only applied on the 30D clean vehicle tax credit. And they had some the language was quite targeted in particular ways. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act introduced a new suite of foreign entities of concern restrictions that apply much more broadly, both to a wider set of credits and they reach a much larger number of companies and affected technologies in terms of how they play out. But there hasn't, I think, been nearly as much discussion about what should be the conditions under which Chinese investment might be allowed if the tax credit question is taken out of the picture. If other forms of federal subsidy or taxpayer subsidy are taken out of the picture. There are obviously Chinese companies that operate in the US without the benefit of any particular taxpayer subsidy, and they tend to attract, I think, somewhat less attention than these more visible cases where it's a question of the tax credits. I think that the question of technology transfer is, I think, as Jeremy indicated before, it's in some ways a new question, and I'm not sure that the discourse and the thinking around it, completely reflects the novelty of that question. Since, as Jeremy indicated, it's only very recently that people started talking seriously in the United States about Chinese investment possibly being a vector for more advanced technology to enter the U.S. economy and for U.S. firms and the U.S. productive system to learn from Chinese companies and from Chinese know-how. I think, there's still resistance to thinking in those terms in many quarters, and there may be conditions under which that seems like the main story, but the older story may still be lurking there somewhere underneath. Or certainly, I think there would be a high burden of proof, or a high, many stakeholders would impose pretty high thresholds to be persuaded that the older concerns don't still apply. But I think we've seen in a prominent case, which you also mentioned, Shawn, the case of Ford and CATL, and the corporate leadership of Ford certainly has been outspoken about this. That they do perceive that the long-term needs of the company and of the U.S. automotive sector to be competitive on a global stage will require some grappling with the technological advances that some Chinese companies and some Chinese sectors have made. And then the question becomes, what are the conditions under which that can work for the U.S. economy and the U.S. political economy? In that particular case, it does seem like even after OBBB, that Ford will still have access to the 45X tax credit for batteries that are made at the Marshall, Michigan facility. Some stakeholders in the U.S. have been supportive of that. The UAW, the Auto Workers Union, secured essentially collective bargaining rights at that facility back when it was announced in February 2023. And so there is the prospect that as that factory comes online, that you might see unionized UAW workers who have the same standards as other UAW workers elsewhere at auto facilities in Michigan. But other stakeholders have raised, I think, really significant concerns along the lines of some of the ones I articulated earlier about whether the U.S. should want or should allow a company like CATL to have a presence in the U.S., even if it's through this sort of licensing arrangement where that company actually has no ownership stake in the factory in question. I think these are challenging questions, and if there's going to be a resolution, I expect it will be highly technical and tied up with very highly technical and very politically contentious, overarching trade negotiations as we are witnessing right now.
Yeah, and we don't think the politics here are going to change overnight. Carol Wise points us to, and in the Q&A section again, if you have a question, pop it in there. She points us to a July op-ed by David Otter and Gordon Hanson in the New York Times, in which, and these are two of the original authors of the China shock literature, which detailed the impact on communities around the United States of competition with Chinese manufacturing and Chinese rise and the loss of jobs. That familiar old story, as you will, as Ted has kind of talked about. But they argued in that op-ed that we're at a China 2.0 moment where actually the U.S. should be opening up and lowering tariff walls and welcoming Chinese EV imports and production. They point to Brazil and Mexico as much more open to Chinese EVs. And Carol asked the question, is the U.S. missing the boat here? And I'm going to throw that question at Jeremy.
I think at some level, like building the facilities instead of like the cars coming on a boat, right? If they're actually being built in the United States, that feels like a win compared in. And then if the alternative is to not have those cleaner, better technologies, cheap and often cheaper ones in the United States, I think that doesn't feel particularly desirable either. And so I think if the choice is between imports, whether they be imports from Chinese-made kind of factories in Mexico or Chinese-owned factories in Mexico, or kind of like factories in Michigan that are hiring under union contract agreements like Americans in order to produce these technologies. I feel like at that level, at the big picture level, I feel pretty confident that there's a lot of opportunities that are kind of like positive sum. I think the concerns that Ted is pointing out that a lot of stakeholders raise are important and need to be negotiated and figured out. The conversation should be about those issues, though, I think, rather than kind of a much kind of a scarier or kind of a racist language of kind of Chinese are thieves, Chinese are communists. We can't allow any kind of interaction with Chinese state or society or firms because of kind of like China bad. That kind of language, I think, is quite problematic. And I think that for instance, Trump, in many ways, for all of his faults, and we could obviously fill much more than an hour talking about those, but on this issue, I do think that he is not fundamentally against the idea of the United States and China retaining some type of economic relationship for all of the kind of attacking language that he has. There was a nice piece in Bloomberg, I forget the author, but it might be the moderator of this panel, about the way that Trump actually thinks about China. And so I would push everyone to read Shawn's piece there. I do think that this idea of actually not just a trade relationship, but an investment relationship is quite desirable. And I think this or has clear positive kind of implications. The concern would be, as I kind of think, that there are a lot of people at the local level, as well as in DC, that have this militarized or kind of like very antagonistic set of beliefs about China. So we've seen state and local restrictions, and I worry there that some of these people are not necessarily going to jump even if Trump asks them to. And so I think that, to me, that's the question that I'm curious what others have as well. This is something Kyle, I was looking at the Q&A function. I saw Kyle Jaros, colleague.
And I was gonna thank you for the shout out, and that's very kind. I mean, that was a piece that I wrote based on just watching Trump talk about China over the last 10 years and how things have changed. And look, the common theme there is this is a man who really wants to do business with China rather than decouple. And we can throw a link in the chat and people can go read it. I may even be able to pull out a gift link for folks. But yeah, you point to Kyle Jaros's question about state level restrictions on Chinese FDI. I mean, we've seen states like Texas really throw up big barriers to Chinese investment. And there's a lot of kind of we should be clear that a lot of this is kind of red baiting, right? I mean, it's kind of red scare language when you look at some of these debates. But I wonder, Kate, if you want to just talk a little bit more about those state level restrictions. I mean, do you see any indication, as Kyle asks, that state legislatures, governors in red states in particular, would reconsider these policies if President Trump suddenly said, we welcome Chinese investment?
Certainly. So I'm not going to be one to predict the politics in this day and age, but I think what's interesting is when you do look at the risks and maybe taking a step back, agree that the risks have been approached asymmetrically with the benefits over the last few years in terms of like the economic tech piece versus the risk and security concerns. And maybe just drawing on an example just raised, I think Brazil is quite interesting because it points to this attitude in the global south where actually Brazil, like because of the flood of Chinese imports, did adopt some degree of tariffs, but then welcomed FDI, but had a much more politically agnostic approach from security perspective, and was basically just trying to create local jobs, add local value. So maybe bringing that back to the U.S. situation, your question about local level policies and politics. When you look at the risks, I think there are a couple of different buckets. And I would say there's a bucket of technical risks like IP, data security, dual use technologies, and then there's personnel and risks related to local land ownership or board structure. And I would say both of these categories of risks have solutions. And those solutions have been delineated in various reports, whatnot. So I think, from the perspective of the higher level politics being able to shift the local level politics, I certainly think there's a relationship there, especially if the solutions do exist. I think the risk that's hardest to mitigate is obviously the supply chain resilience and dependency risk. But I think, a approach that advocates for some degree of, dual track where you both, continue to use Chinese inputs at the same time that you're diversifying your supply chain. The cost of that versus complete independence are quite different. But at a local level, certainly because there are solutions for a lot of the risks that have received pushback from local governments, if there is a higher level shift in the politics, it will be really interesting to watch how that plays out and sort of trickles down to a local level. And of course, the role of Chinese companies and also trying to figure out strategies that cater to local needs and interests. I think it was really interesting. I think it was Goshen that has another Illinois-based plant where they partnered with the local community college to create training programs for some of the local workers and try and mitigate some of the local pushback. So, I think at the same time that we're watching the US side politics, it'll be interesting to see because these are mostly private firms on the Chinese side, and that's really important to keep in mind, and their interest in the market, so their capacity and willingness to innovate from sort of a localization perspective is also a interesting factor in all of this.
I mean, it's fascinating because when I first landed here in Washington 10 years ago, I was with the Financial Times at the time, and I spent a lot of time traveling around the U.S. and there was a striking openness at the local level to Chinese investment, right? I mean, I remember going to a Chamber of Commerce meeting in Chicago for the kind of regional for the Midwest, and meeting someone who was talking about a Chinese company buying a former pickle factory in Indiana to turn it into a place where they were going to make rims, and really being having a really strong relationship with local officials. And that was striking. They were going in and they were doing economic development essentially, and that was the view of certainly that this executive was selling. I wonder, Ted, but we're 10 years on from that, and we're one trade war. We've been through one trade war and we're into a second. But I wonder at the union level, and you talked about this as well, this kind of the different attitudes depending on the employer and the shop and the facility that's there. I wonder, have you seen an evolution in the union discussion there? Is a union discussion more of an anti-China one now than it was 10 years ago, or is there openness to Chinese investment?
From what I've seen, it really depends on the union and it depends on the sector in question. But I think that for unions that have historically, or let's say over the last 15, 20 years, represented workers in sectors that have faced a high level of import competition from Chinese manufacturers, the sense of conflict is very high. And I don't think it has receded because the intensity of import competition from Chinese manufacturing has not receded. If anything, in many sectors, it has intensified. I think other unions in the U.S. that have historically not represented as many members in sectors that have faced direct import competition may have demonstrated at times a more, let's say, more of a deal-making attitude with respect to Chinese investment, wherein the critical questions are really just about the quality of the jobs that are being created, and if those jobs are going to match U.S. standards and especially match union standards, then those employers should be treated the same as any other non-Chinese, American, European, any other employer would be treated, right? They should be judged on the basis of whether those jobs are good jobs and whether they meet union standards. But there isn't uniformity within the U.S. labor movement on that exact question. And I don't know that I've seen an evolution so much as there are different views that I think reflect how different unions and different workers have been placed over the last 2 decades with respect to the Chinese economy and to competition from Chinese firms. And that stands to change in various ways going forward, right? I mean, one of the ways we've been talking about, obviously, is the conditions under which Chinese firms appear to have leadership in certain technologies that may be quite critical to the future of the world economy, and therefore to U.S. firms as well. But the other direction is the intensifying competition from Chinese manufacturers in sectors where they used to not figure in global markets really at all, right? In particular, high value added markets, or things like vehicles, right? Where, as I'm sure all of us know, Chinese firms were a non-factor as recently as 3 or 4 years ago in auto exports, and now are surging ahead of all of the established leaders. So there are vectors that are pushing, I think, in both directions that could easily change the outlook of a number of U.S. stakeholders, including unions, but also including local elected officials and economic development agencies and all the others who have to look out for the well-being of local and regional economies in a changing international landscape.
We've got some great questions coming in the Q&A function. Keep them coming. Stephen makes a good point. When it comes to climate change and green technology, there should be multiple win-win investments. We can see that case, although there are obviously national security questions that people have out there. But he wonders, are there other sectors and or technologies where there could be joint ventures? And I'm going to throw that to either Kate or Jeremy. Let's see who's first on the draw. I think Jeremy's pointing to you, Kate, so off you go.
Yeah, I was going to say, I focus primarily on clean tech sectors, so I think I'm less knowledgeable about this. And I think, part of it is, again, like which sectors on the China side are interested in investing in the US. So I think that's certainly a consideration. And from that perspective, clean tech sectors obviously have been the primary vehicle for foreign direct investment in manufacturing in recent years. At the same time, high tech sectors, I imagine, that are sort of a bit more outside my wheelhouse, that have more military or security implications, probably should be much more closely scrutinized. But Jeremy, not sure if you have additional thoughts on this question.
Yeah, Jeremy, I mean, I was just trying to kind of rack my brains on this, and the thing that immediately came up, and I'm surprised it's taken us this long to mention it, is rare earth magnets, right? These are this great source of leverage now that the Chinese have. They've put these export controls in place. This is something that's being discussed and will be discussed by President Trump and Xi Jinping when they meet later this week in South Korea. But can we envision a world in which rare earth processing, which is something that the Chinese have a real strong monopoly on right now, they invest in the U.S. Although the irony, of course, is that there are U.S. companies that have invested in Chinese plants that do some of this rare earth processing.
Yeah, the rare earth conundrum is so fascinating because it is these things. First, they're not as rare as we think. Second, the economic value of them in a price sense is actually very small. The US imports from China of rare earth magnets and materials was something like $180 million on a scale of trade of like orders of magnitude greater than that. And so the actual amount of money is not very large, but then if Ford is shutting down production facilities because it doesn't have access to the particular magnets that the model requires, then the value is actually kind of very kind of disproportionately significant. And then there are lots of other technologies where we just don't have substitutes for these materials. So something about the electrochemical or material processes that allow turbine blades to turn at the speeds that they do without falling apart requires these kind of various rare earths. I think it's hard right now. The Chinese government understands that it has leverage both at the actual material as well as the processing of these materials. That being said, this is a major opportunity, and there are firms that think that they can move into this space. And I think the part of the problem that is quite difficult to solve is that the way that Chinese firms have often responded to these moments is to kind of like flood the market and to keep prices very low. And so to keep investment outside of China kind of relatively kind of weak, or kind of not particularly interested in turning profits. And so one of the things that you've heard the Trump administration talk about is creating kind of price floors, which is not something that we always think about, right? But so in order to keep the price of these materials attractive to non-Chinese investment, to make sure that to promise essentially that the United States or other entities would secure these materials at relatively high prices. But given that these materials are so cheap overall and such a small portion of the overall project, or kind of, there's not a lot of rare earth materials in a car. And so if you have to pay a 30 to 40% premium of them, that doesn't actually affect the cost of the car in any real way, but it allows the mine or processing facilities to actually operate economically as opposed to not. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways in which we think about resilience that in this kind of new geopolitical world that we're living in, that kind of pushes, and I think thinking about risk, not just in geopolitical risk, but thinking about just relying on a single operator or a single facility for your materials in any particular fashion can be quite disastrous. Ford again there was a facility for aluminum, I believe, earlier in upstate New York this year that kind of led to Ford, that was kind of a key component for materials for Ford trucks, that kind of led to a loss in the quarter for $1.5 billion of lost profits. And so that kind of like relying on a single facility, whether it be a Chinese facility, an American facility, or something else, I think just pushes to think through resilience more deeply for American manufacturers or just kind of global supply chains broadly.
If I could come in on this point really quick as
Yeah,
well,
go for
just one thing to add, I think, from a materials perspective, there's an interesting, advantage in terms of recycling. If we're able to onshore more recycling capacity for batteries, which is something where China does have technology that's quite advanced, that's something that also hedges against some of those material dependency risks, and could be a leveraging again of, like areas where we could advantage ourselves by working with China instead of sort of cutting them out of the market. So, there's some interesting synergies there.
We're coming into the kind of final furlongs here of this discussion. I wonder. I feel like I should bring George Carlisle, who's been dumping a lot of interesting questions into the Q&A section into this. I mean, he makes a point. Are the cost structures too high in the United States? And also makes the point that power infrastructure is a big issue. And likewise, I'd like to bring in one of our anonymous attendees who argues that stricter screening of Chinese investments might discourage other international investors. And what might the potential consequences be for the US economy and its position in global supply chains and global investment network? He uses the term. Ted, I'm going to throw that bundle of questions at you first.
I'm not sure I'm totally qualified to speak to the second question, but on the first, I guess I would say that it is certainly the belief of many stakeholders in the U.S., and certainly the ones that I work most closely with from the labor movement and from the environmental movement in the U.S., that high standards are a good thing, that high standards protect the well-being of people and the environment, and that high standards are things that people have fought and died for in this country, and that we should be pretty committed to retaining. And that we need a trading regime globally that validates those high standards and that does not serve as a sort of standing threat to arbitrage against them by incentivizing the location of production in places that have lowered labor and environmental standards. So as a person who comes out of that world, my hackles go up very quickly when we start talking about the U.S. being a high cost jurisdiction or a high cost place for manufacturing. Obviously, we have a huge and robust manufacturing ecosystem in the U.S. and in many respects. It has shrunk in some regards, in part due to arbitrage of that sort. And it remains, I think, a standing priority of the labor movements and the environmental movements in the U.S. to work against that, right? It's always promised that the global trading regime should not undermine labor and environmental standards, but more often than not, that's just genuflection, and things that are in deals are not enforced, and important things are not in deals at all. So that's kind of the perspective that I come at it from. Now, does that mean that we should be indifferent to frictions and to costs in the U.S. economy? Of course not. There always are, and there will continue to be plenty of things that intelligent policy and good cooperation between stakeholders can do to increase competitiveness, to increase the productivity of U.S. firms, without sacrificing core labor and environmental standards and various other standards that many people have fought for and that we have a right to demand and to want to have in this country.
So with three minutes left, I'm going to throw a last question at you, and that's come from Valentina Shu in our chat there, and she says, "What's anticipated of Trump and Xi's meeting in 3 days?" So I'm going to ask you, and I know panelists love to predict the future, but I'm going to ask you all to tell us what you expect and whether you think some kind of investment component might be part of a deal that we get to. Why don't we give Ted a break and go to you, Jeremy, first, and then we'll go to Kate and then back to Ted.
So the potential meeting, which now seems likely to happen, is the reason why we timed this call and discussion for when we did. And I think the theme being about not just the deal itself, but about the possibility of investment, I think, to me, suggests that I think that it could be. Maybe the reporting that's happened over the past few days and over the weekend in Malaysia about a framework for a deal has not been particularly heavy on language about investment, especially when we're talking about physical investment of factories and something else, maybe more financial investments about TikTok or sales, what have you. But I think the possibility that Trump will want to have some big number as about Chinese investment in the United States as part of a deal, to me, I think thinking through what are the political implications of that possibility and for different stakeholders, whether that be the union level or local governments or actors in various ways. I think there are those in Washington on both sides of the aisle who want to push back against all possibility of this as kind of China or Trump being weak on China. And I think trying to think through and kind of push through the different parts of that discussion is why I was really excited to have this discussion. This is me vamping because I don't want to say that I have specific prediction, but so maybe talking about the context allows me to turn it over to others to make more specific predictions.
Yeah, that's very effective dodging of the question there, Jeremy. Kate, I ask you to please not dodge the question. What do you expect?
Good question. The question we're all asking or waiting for. I would temper expectations around any sort of near-term signal on the investment front. I think what we're seeing from a US-China perspective in terms of the framework that was reported on over the last 24 hours, whatnot, is more what I see as a de-escalation of the recent tit for tat rather than anything new. And it's sort of bringing us back to where we could have been a couple months ago had things not escalated after the BIS 50% rule and the export controls from China. That said, I think, channeling some of the analysis from my fantastic colleagues at the Center for China Analysis, I think part of the key to watch for is what will happen in terms of Trump and Xi next meeting, a potential Trump trip to Beijing. Obviously, some sort of investment deal requires a lot of regulatory work, and both sides want to come out on top. I think it's interesting to see Trump coming into this meeting with quite a strong, sort of couple of days in Southeast Asia and in the Asian region. So I think that's certainly something to take into account. But on the investment front, maybe keep an eye on it, but I would personally temper expectations in the near term. But no insider knowledge, of course.
Yeah, no, of course. Ted, over to you for the kind of closing thought.
Well, again, no intel that would allow me to say anything definitive, but I think I would agree with Kate, and just say that, my observation is that in other trade negotiations so far, the only concession that Trump has ever really offered is the relaxation of the tariffs that he himself has imposed. And given all the things that we've discussed, including in particular the litany of existing barriers, let's say, to Chinese investment in the U.S. economy that are already there, and in many cases laws at the state and federal level, if the Chinese side was looking for relaxation of those, that would be a complicated process, and it seems very unlikely that it could be resolved in the kinds of negotiations that are happening right now. But anything is possible with Donald Trump and trade negotiations, so we will have to wait and see.
Yeah. Look, well, we've reached the end of our discussion here. I'm about to get kicked out of this conference room, so that's one good reason to bring things to an end. But I think the way I think about what's happening this week is it's the start or another chapter in a longer conversation. This is not the big deal that we're getting to yet. I think we in the news business always focus on the today, and I think sometimes we need to think a bit longer and be a bit more patient into the future. Lots of good questions in there that we haven't answered, and my apologies for that. But with that, I want to thank everyone for joining today's discussion. Ted, Kate, and Jeremy, you were great. You brought lots of wise insights, and I thank you for that. This will all be available on YouTube, which everyone who participated today and listened in should share widely once it's up there to all of your social media followers, so I can finally do that thing that my teenage daughter really wants her father to do, and that is go viral in some way. I'm sure this is a topic that will get us going viral. So thank you all. Really appreciate it, and I got to run.